Welcome to Inside the Founders Studio. We're a podcast dedicated to uncovering the grit that make founders, entrepreneurs, and innovative thinkers tick in one of the most crucial industries on the planet, supply chain. To learn more, you can check us out at InsideTheFoundersStudio.com. But for now, let's hand it to our host, Ryan Schreiber.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Inside the Founders Studio. I'm Ryan Schreiber. And today I have a guest that is pretty personal to me. I have Noam Frankel, who's currently the founder and CEO of FreightFriend. But Noam has been an industry innovator for over 30 years, going back to deregulation. He's low-key probably one of the most important people in the history of the industry, in brokerage particularly. And, he's a person who gave me a chance when I needed it desperately, when I was out of school and couldn't find work, the recession, et cetera. Like, I walked into Echo and Noam gave me a job and gave me a chance. And then, we started a company together and we've been friends since then. So Noam, thanks a lot for joining me. I'll say on this podcast right now, thanks for everything you've done for me in my career. And I'm excited to have you on today. So thanks for joining me.
Ryan, thanks so much for having me. I was really looking forward to this conversation. And thank you for all the time that we've spent together. It's been great to work together in the same company and great to watch you become such a spokesperson and brain for the industry now.
I'm excited to have you on and talk to you about your journey because I think it'll be a really interesting one for everyone to learn about. It It certainly tracks like the evolution of transportation over the last actually 40 years now, I guess, right? Deregulation is 41 years ago. Not to date you, but certainly that'll be interesting. And as you know, I really want to learn about kind of how people have dealt with some of the trials and tribulations. So it'll be interesting to talk about kind of when you left Backhaulers and you left earlier and kind of how that was. Why don't you, for starters, maybe talk or give an introduction to today as FreightFriend? Why don't you give an introduction to what FreightFriend is and what you guys are working on there, and then we'll certainly come back to that in the journey, and I think people will understand why you're working on it.
Yeah, thank you. So I would say for 40 years, my focus on training a lot of people in the industry has been around the importance of building relationships. That a truckload industry is an industry of relationships, and that's a key element of the process. So FreightFriend is called FreightFriend. It's a cloud-based AI-powered truckload procurement solution that helps shippers, brokers, and carriers match the right capacity to the right freight. So we believe in building relationships first and then driving automation to increase efficiencies for everybody. We help people do that through an intuitive carrier CRM, our dynamic routing guide, which we call Capacity Guru, and Freight Guru, which drives intelligent freight matches to carriers. So that's FreightFriend really is a transition for really what I think I've been teaching and promoting in the mantra. I've been, I'm on my soapbox for 40 years, certainly which you got a lot of when you first started.
I get a lot of it now too. So, and I agree with it, which is I think why we've worked so well together. It always came very intuitively to me. Why don't you, before we get into like a professional career, why don't you kind of talk to me a little bit about, or tell everybody a little bit about what it was like growing up? Where are you from? How'd you grow up? What was it like being little Noam? And we get into that other stuff later.
Yeah. So I'm what's known as a CK, a clergy's kid. My father I'm Jewish. My father was a clergyman, so we bounced around a fair amount when I was growing up and young. But for the most part, after fourth grade, I grew up in the north suburbs of Chicago. Went to high school there, went to college out east in Philadelphia, and then came back to Chicago and really had been there ever since. And Chicago was a hub of transportation originally through railroads, through highways, and it became a hub of logistics as well, which was interesting. It didn't have to be that way.
When you were a kid, did you have any interest in transportation? Like you just said, there was, used to be. Did you have any interest in it, or or like everybody else, no, you just fell ass backwards into it?
No, I would say actually I went to college and went through 2 years of playing Frisbee and writing fiction, but majored in economics because that's where most of my courses were. And my senior year, where I could take a lot of flexible courses, I took a course in the graduate Wharton School called Economics of Transportation. And I was fascinated right away. I would say as a kid, I always loved maps. I think that's true for all of us. We love maps. And I think I miss taking out a map and marking your whole route and just letting Google Maps tell us what to do. It's part of us all becoming brain dead. But this course, Economic Transportation, really drove my interest. And then I left school in 82, 83, similar period of economically to when you graduated law school, looking for a job in public sector and transportation. Regional RTA, which is Chicago metro area, is regional transportation, CTA, and there were no jobs. So I started expanding my search to consulting firms and ended up meeting a consultant who was helping people helping companies get authority to utilize their private fleet to backhaul other people's freight, because that was only just then available.
Slow down, right? Because we'll get obviously we'll get into that piece of the journey, because that's going to be really, really interesting. I think a struggle for us in this conversation is even though I've known you at this point for 12 years, 11 years, like I learn stuff about transportation every time I talk to you. So let's go back. So you were younger when you were growing up. I know you play ultimate Frisbee a lot now. Was that like a thing when you were a kid? Did you play sports? What were your hobbies? Like, were you really into music? Like, what was that? What did you do when you were a kid? What was it like being little you?
Little me was a fairly sheltered life, definitely Jewish, though my father was a cantor. That's the singing person in a synagogue. So music has been a huge part of our family forever, and it's a huge part of our extended family. My oldest brother was clearly going to be playing music since he was like 11, and by 13 he was jamming in a Gata Davida with bands in our living room, and I'd be sitting there listening to it. So music was a big part of our family for sure. I played sports, but couldn't participate in most organized sports because I had celebrated the Sabbath on Saturday when everything was occurring. Mm-hmm. So actually, the first time I started to play organized sports was my sophomore year of college when I found ultimate Frisbee, and have really played ever since. And it's had a big impact on my life, as well as getting involved in the American Backhaulers. And actually, those two things kind of followed side by side, which is an interesting story.
Yeah, definitely. When you were obviously a good student, you said, obviously because you went to the University of Pennsylvania, which you intimated earlier because you said Wharton, but you said you kind of lived a bit of a sheltered life. Was there a part of you that struggled with that, or did you kind of not know what you didn't know? Like, was there a part of you that like didn't feel? I don't know. How did you want to be more fulfilled? Were you kind of trying to reach out, or did you feel like, hey, I had a good childhood, everything was fine, like, my family was great, and what was that kind of experience like? Because obviously the school part must have been easy, I would guess. Just from knowing you.
Any other clergy kids who are listening to this podcast will have a pretty decent idea, right? Family is the community and the congregation, right? And so that really was a big chunk of our family life. My father was an incredible person, really beloved through communities all around the U.S., but that was his whole life. And I would say my world was small. And then when I went to high school, I went to a public high school. I went to a grade school. I went to a Jewish day school for grade school. And suddenly I'm thrust into this, 1,500 person per class high school, which was vast. I wanted to get beyond my world, but I was not very experienced. So I would say one of the things that Ultimate did is help me really come into my own, expand my world, and be surrounded by some big personalities who had a lot of amazing interests. And but yeah, I would say I was smart enough to do well in school and empowered with the right motivational things that got me going. My brain would definitely start working and being really creative.
Did you have a job growing up, or what was?
Oh yeah, I was working by the age of 12. By the age of, oh, this is a good question that I forgot. By the age of 15, my sophomore, junior year of high school, I was the manager of materials flow at ESMA Chemicals. ESMA Chemicals was a dental technician, a PhD, who was building electropolishing units for
Jesus.
cleaning braces or cleaning dental whatever.
And not adhering to child labor laws, apparently, but go ahead.
Well, so I was, yeah, we had very little money growing up, right? My dad was very spiritual and not very business oriented. My mother worked her whole life too. She ended up having a PhD, but not a lot of business going on there. So we didn't have a lot of money. So I definitely worked, but I was the manager of materials flow, which basically meant that I would have to create a plan for how many units they wanted to produce and all the parts that I needed to order them. And then the hardest part of it was talking to all the vendors and telling them why I couldn't pay their bills.
Huh. things are coming together nicely for me.
But that's supply chain. That's supply chain, right? So
well, I remember. No, I mean, like, it's funny you say that, because I remember one of the first when we first started working together at Echo. One of the first, I got into a situation, relatively early on with some shipments, and I had to give bad news to the customer. And I came to you and I was like, Noam, here's what's going on. And I vividly remember you being like, you need to have that conversation with them. You need to have that difficult conversation with them. And I would imagine some of that came from you learning early on, like, the value of being able to have difficult conversations with people, get through it, but still maintain the relationship. Am I kind of putting too much into that, or no?
Yeah, I don't know if telling a bunch of people that I had no relationship that I couldn't pay their bills, but maybe I did because I ordered them. I mean, I was maybe, but absolutely. I mean,
it's different because you were the customer and they were the vendor, and then this situation, I was the vendor and they were the customer.
Yeah,
but still,
I was still a 14-year-old or 15-year-old kid. So, but I think there's no question that part of the reason you have relationships is because things in our industry go wrong frequently.
Yeah,
and when you have that relationship, you can manage that situation, whatever it might be, much better. And that's important, regardless of whether it's on the carrier side or the customer side. And you build that relationship through engaging, not through running away, through engaging, talking about it, taking their anger, them being allowed to blow their top and know that you are still standing there and working with them. And it's okay because they're justified to be pissed.
Totally. That's an interesting job for a 15-year-old to have. Your first introduction to supply chain probably there too, right?
I kind of forget that sometimes, but yeah.
I think it's interesting when I look back on my life when I was in high school. Like, I worked, which I think I worked for a small school supply distribution company, and I was doing LTL. I never had any idea that I would be involved in this industry broadly, and I hate LTL now. So it's funny. It's funny that was my introduction, because LTL seemed like it made so much sense back then. And now it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Did you, when you were a kid, did you ever have that, like, I've been asking people the same thing, and I just finished watching Last Dance, and you grew up in Chicago. Did you ever have that Michael Jordan, like, didn't make the varsity basketball team moment is there something like that? Not necessarily related to sports, but did you have something that in your kind of like formative years where, there was a major disappointment that kind of stuck with you or stays with you?
I think, athletics for me is once again a big focus, because I love it. The value of team sports in terms of creating you as a person and to be able to negotiate issues and to work with people and build relationships is huge. I would encourage anybody to do it. That being said, my athletic skill set, and my physical skill set, and I would say also my athletic work ethic, was not in the same realm as the people that I was playing with. I was fortunate to be able to play on a team that was national and world champions, incredible experience with incredible athletes, powerful personalities. So I was always hard on myself, like a lot of us. And I would, if I underperformed, which from my expectations, which was frequent, I would, beat myself up. And so I think that was definitely a challenge for me, whereas school came really easy. Business pretty early on came really easy. Athletics, because I just didn't have the tool set, was more of a challenge. And that's where I beat myself up a fair amount.
When you were growing up, was there anybody you really looked up to? Like, was there anybody you kind of said, I want to grow up to be like Mike?
Well, Michael Jordan. So it's interesting you bring up Mike, because I had season tickets from the year he got injured, his second season to the Bulls. So my kids grew up to some degree in Chicago. I'm totally changing your question, but that's
okay.
Anyway, my kids grew up going to the Bulls games, and I still get crap for. We had 2 tickets, and I had 2 sons, and I still get crap for making my what. He was probably 5, but they keep pushing it up in the story to when he was 13, that I'd make him sit on my lap so we could get him in free. In those days, if you carried a kid in, you could get him free and they could sit on your lap. So, but, my father certainly was a motivating force in terms of how he dealt with people, particularly in periods of joy and despair. He was amazingly skilled at giving people comfort and at taking situations that still make me and so many people uncomfortable, and just with his big smile and his warmth, being able to make the situation better. So that, and for me, does not come so easy. So that is something that I definitely, I aspire to. And Ryan, you probably know this from working with me. I'm very focused on what needs to be done next, or what we're doing wrong. I had this conversation with somebody else recently about your approach to management. There's people that are very focused on the successes, and I'm very focused on moving forward and where we're going next. And with people who don't know me, that can sometimes come across as harsh or critical, and not enough pat on the back. So
for people who do know you, it can come off as harsh and critical too. Yeah. But that's neither here nor there. When you were a kid, I kind of hear like you cared a lot about athletics, but you weren't always that motivated in athletics. School was easy for you. What was motivating for you when you were a kid to be, to kind of like be a high performer in the classroom, to be, to be able, because like, even if it's easy for you to get into Penn, right, to be able to have the academic career that you had is hard. So what motivated you when you were a kid to kind of reach those levels of success even before you got into your professional life?
Yeah, the childhood conversation is interesting for me. That goes deeper in a lot of reasons, but I wouldn't say I wasn't motivated in athletics. I just wasn't disciplined as an athlete. Disciplined in terms of preparation. Anytime, look, every year that we got older growing up, your kid could be a rock star in T-ball, and then he has to be on the big field, and then he makes it to high school. And for sports or academics or anything, as you get older, people start to focus on certain things. So the talent and the skill sets gets better and better, so that at a certain point, you're competing against people that have all mostly your caliber of skill set, whether that's academically, athletically, whatever. And the difference is the work ethic and the preparation. And I would say I wasn't disciplined as an athlete in terms of knowing how to take care of myself and prepare myself physically to be able to perform at my top. Now I am, because if I want to continue to do the things I love to do, which is mountain bike riding and skiing now, and still playing ultimate, playing basketball, if I don't prepare, I'm going to get hurt, and then I'm out for 6 weeks. So I've learned to become a disciplined athlete so I can continue to do the things I love to do. I would say I was not that disciplined as a kid. So academically, to the extent that I recall, it came fairly easy to me. And I chose my university because I had a good time on my road trip when I was in Philly that night. And I obviously got good enough grades and good enough scores that I was able to get at it. That may sound arrogant, but I've been blessed with certain talents. Everybody's blessed with something. Those people that are lucky are the lucky enough ones that can find to focus their life on things that they enjoy,
Mm-hmm.
they happen to be
Mm-hmm.
good at. Ryan,
Totally.
we talked about this before, but I didn't necessarily maximize it because of the lack of discipline. And
Yeah.
I know friends that maybe didn't get their lives and their careers off with a bang like I did at the age of 22, but have gone much further because of that level of discipline. And I would say
Mm-hmm.
that's been a lot of my limitation every step of the way is the discipline. I have tended as a kid in my choices personally and in professionally, I fly by the seat of my pants, and I'm a visionary and creative. And sometimes it gets challenging for those around me to follow along.
Yeah.
Especially, it's like dancing with me. It's like I'm not going to follow dance lessons or be told what to do. I'm going to kind of be random. I'm a good dancer, but it's really tough on the partner. So
Yeah, totally. You and Elaine from Seinfeld, great dancers. So, I would say it makes perfect sense. I mean, and to your point about people finding the thing that they're best at, it's also, pretty rare that people find something that they're really good at and that they also enjoy. That was some struggle for me for a long time. I know in my professional life is like there were things that I was really, really good at. So I thought I needed to do them professionally. And they just made me unhappy and they made me miserable. And I also tend to focus on, and I tend to see myself as really average in most things. And so I look at all the things that I'm not so great at. Like, we could spend the whole lifetime talking about the things that I'm terrible at, but then you to your point, you tend to right, you get praise for the things that you're good at, and people focus you there, even if you can't focus yourself there. Over time. So okay, so moving kind of so you go to Wharton, you go to or excuse me, you go to Penn.
yeah, I did not go to Wharton. I went to a class in Wharton.
You graduate, you come back to Chicago.
Yeah.
And you start getting into, so you meet a consultant. This is where we start to get into the American Backhaulers part of the story, right?
Yeah. So I worked at Scornavaco's Pizza when I first got back in college, and I almost and I sold laser art in Gary, Indiana, to offices walking the streets for one day, and quit that job.
Was it less dangerous then or more dangerous then?
I don't know. It was just miserable.
The idea of
I don't think I was ever smart enough to be scared in different neighborhoods, but it was miserable. I took a job with an air freight company that's whole business strategy was that they were minority owned from a woman who really had nothing to do with the business. Mm-hmm. And I didn't last long there. But then I met a consultant who had developed a transportation consulting firm who was focused on helping private fleets get authority to haul other people's freight right out of deregulation. So this is 1982, 1983. Deregulation was in 1980. So this was Jim Stone, part of the Stone container family, had a consulting firm called Stone Management Group. And he's actually the person who hired me to work. And his object was for me to get backhaul freight for his clients that he'd helped to get authority. And I did that. He placed me in with Paul Loeb to do that, who had just started this company, American Backhaulers, and was doing it half time on the side in his dad's office, who was a broker for aggregate and sand. He was a Martin Marietta broker. Herb Loeb, great guy, who passed away a few years ago. And I think a lot of people from CH, from American Backhaulers, knew him because he always worked in their office. But we worked in his office.
Paul returned the favor.
Paul, yeah. So we worked out of his office at 407 South Dearborn. And Paul, when I first met him, he was doing that halftime. He was brokering sand, and he was backhauling the sand on Sealy Posturepedic trucks from Florida back to Chicago. And then when I joined him, that's when he went to it in full time. And there we go.
So one quick follow, was it as cheap to move Florida to Chicago then as it is now? Like how?
Yeah. So
just curious.
That's a stunning question. So our pricing algorithm then that we first did, that Paul told me, I'm pretty sure, was $1 a mile. And to some degree, this is
everything was $1 a mile, or
Yeah.
Florida. Okay.
He just said, quote $1 a mile, quote $1 a mile. Paul trained me, and look, Paul's one of the greatest guys and one of the best salespeople I have ever met, and clearly brilliant financial manager as well. He trained me by telling me $1 a mile and throwing a yellow pages at me and telling me, he didn't throw it at me, and telling me to call sand companies. And that's kind of how, and then we figured it out together from there. But interestingly enough, if you think about that, 1982 rates that we pay trucks have not gone up that much.
I mean, truckers will certainly, any truckers who listen to this will certainly glom onto that. I want to come back to that in a second. Part of the reason I'm doing this podcast comes from, my journey and when I left my last business and how I kind of went through this journey of learning and discovery and talking to folks about what their journeys were and seeing some of the places where they were similar to mine and helping work through kind of with myself almost as therapy, how they dealt with certain challenges I did. So I'm curious. So with that point, to your point, when you came out of school, you had something you wanted to do. There were economic challenges. You did some other stuff. It was like, for me, that was really frustrating, right? Like the pounding the pavement, my story, but how I walked around and I suit and tie, walked into law firms, pounded the pavement, handed folks my resume. That was just, I every day it killed me every single day. I mean, the rejection just mounting and mounting. And I had a couple of folks who took me in and sort of said, hey, you can shadow us. You can come with us to court. There were some family law attorneys. And that buoyed me a bunch before I ended up at Echo. But I found that just soul crushing. What was that? I mean, how did you deal with that phase where you had a plan, right? You said, I'm going to go to school. I took this transportation course with economics. Maybe I'll get into our, regional transit or what have you. And then the whole thing, Mike Tyson, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. Okay, you get punched in the face, it's not working out. What was that like for you? Was it frustrating? Was it like, did you not give a fuck? Like, how did you deal with that? And do you think that's impacted you going forward from there?
Yeah, those are really good questions. So I don't remember I looked hard for a job then, and I got a lot of rejection. Mm-hmm. I don't remember the feeling then of what that felt like, but I will say that I've never looked for a job since. I've been an entrepreneur for a reason, and one of those reasons is I hate looking for a job, and I hate getting judged, and I hate rejection. And I have a lot of ideas, and I just want to do them, and I'm a startup guy. I'm good at it. That doesn't give me any fear or discomfort. But I would say the other thing that I want that I was thinking about as you asked that question is, once again, very few people, everybody I think is good at something, and probably many things, and they're probably good at something that they will really love. The lucky few are the people who find that. Mm-hmm. And let's face it, Jews and lots of other ethnicisms, you're like law school or medical school or whatever it is. We don't know what the hell. We're going to school at the age of 18. We're drunk half the time, and then we're making a professional decision. So the point is, and Ryan, you can talk about this as soon as I shut up and talk about your experience with why you went to law school, right? Yeah. The point is, when you do search, get to know yourself and be open to opportunities. A lot of this, finding where you can really succeed and be happy, is pure luck. And so if you're not open,
trial and error,
you'll miss the opportunity that gets presented in front of your face.
For what it's worth, I still have no idea. I'm 37 years old. If you're not in sales, if you're not a lawyer, a doctor, an accountant, I guess an engineer, now I know engineers, I still have no fucking idea what people do for a living. Like, I have no idea. Like, I don't know. I still don't know. It's a good, I think that's a good point. And to your point about being open to things, I have a philosophy. I have a theory on Amazon. particularly, Jeff Bezos gets a lot of credit for being this visionary. Like Jeff Bezos didn't design AWS when he was thinking about Amazon, but he hired smart people who were problem solvers. And when they solved a problem in a creative way and came to him and said, hey, there might be an opportunity here, he said, that sounds interesting. Let me learn more. Instead of saying, fuck you, stay in your lane, right? Do what I'm telling you to do. That's, right. He was open, kind of to your point, which I think was interesting. You said you hate rejection, but I find that interesting in my experience with you because you're one of the better salespeople that I've ever known. You seem to, I remember one time you said to me, there are people, there are basically three types of people in sales. There's people who like wake up every day and really are excited to do sales and like love it. And it's in their blood. That was like Patrick Sheldon is a guy who comes to mind, or Costa Anaziris is a guy who come to mind that you and I both know. And I'm going to have Costa on this podcast at some point. I talked to him the other day about it.
Yeah, he'd be great.
He's like the best natural salesperson I think I've ever known. Then there's the middle type of person who wakes up every day and is like, all right, well, I got to get through it, but I'm not miserable. And then there's the people who are miserable. My experience with you is you're more the first kind of person than any of the other kinds. Like you actually enjoy sales. You enjoy the hunt. You enjoy but am I wrong about that? Am I getting that wrong?
Yeah,
if that's true, how do you marry those two things together?
I don't think that's true. I mean, Paul was, like I said, one of the best salespeople that I ever met. I think salespeople who are really good do let rejection just float off their shoulder and they don't care. And I don't think I'm like that. I think I really enjoy people and I enjoy the conversation. And I'm an ops guy. I'm a problem solver. So I like to understand what their problems are if they will engage with me and help figure out I legitimately believe I can find them a solution. If there's not a fit there and we don't connect, I don't push it, right? And I think good salesmen have to go because it's hard to get those doors to open. Let's face it, when I first started selling American Backhaulers, there weren't very many people offering, freight brokerage. And we were quoting $1 a mile, which was cheap then, right? Because it grew out deregulation. So I built my base was the metals industry. I found my way from sand to recycled batteries to lead recycling to the metals industry, right? And metals industry was a brokerage industry. It was a low value commodity that the freight spend was a big component of the total cost of goods. And so I built my thing in the metals industry, was good at what I did, and it kind of spread. So I don't know that I did that much sales, and I was in charge operationally at American Backhaulers at the age of 23 or 24 or something. I don't know, something ridiculous. So I think I genuinely enjoy having a conversation with people and collaborating and coming up with creative solutions. And if there's not that connection, I just don't push it. So.
All right, so let's talk backhaulers for a few minutes. I mean, it's like, what else is there to talk about in freight? But so backhaulers, you meet Paul. You're kind of working in this office. How long had Paul been doing this part-time and then training you to do it?
Backhaulers was organized as a company in 82 and I came in 83. So I think about 6 months. It really, really grew right out of deregulation, right? Mm-hmm. And he called it American Backhaulers, and he was smart enough to get the number 1-800-Haulers. And that made a big difference then. So yeah, he went into it full time when I joined.
So the two of you
in Herb's office. Yeah.
So the two of you are going into it full time. Talk a little bit about, talk a little bit about the early years, what it was like, kind of starting that business and building it up and really seeing it kind of explode. And how did it explode? And like, what was the kind of the secret sauce?
Yeah. I mean, trucking then was a pretty staid industry. The asset of the authority, right? And before deregulation, a carrier had to have authority to haul from any one state to any other state. So carriers would build up these licenses of authority, which they placed a value of millions of dollars on their books. So after deregulation, there was a huge period of carrier bankruptcies because their assets were gone, and suddenly their ability to get debt was gone, and it was a completely different game. And I would say we were two really smart young people in an industry that was really staid. And we worked collaboratively together, designing operational processes. I mean, our first load board was a big rack that we moved the load over from ordered to booked to checked in to picked up to delivered. It had columns. It was a steel rack. And that is how we replicated our first technology load board. And step by step, we just figured out organizational ways that made a big difference. Some of those were committing on the load, right? Taking the load and committing on it. Nobody was doing that then. They would say, let me see if I can find a truck. We started quoting a rate, sticking to that rate, committing on the freight, and finding some way to move it, and the willingness to take losses if we quoted wrong, and quickly learning that how to quote right, because we weren't funded by some private equity company who would let you burn cash like till your face turned blue. So if you quoted wrong, A, you worked your tail off all day to move one stupid load, and B, then you still lost money. So that's how you learn to quote right. So I think we developed, and on the sales side and on the financial side, Paul really led it. On the operational side, I started to focus on the division into carrier and customer, and on a phone system. I worked with a phone consultant to identify and separate calls from, if you're on a load, if you're looking for a load, or if you are looking to move a load, right? Drivers, carriers, customers. And so some of those operational things we set up, we definitely created the split model then just out of I assume we created, maybe somebody else had it before. And then pretty quickly, I realized the potential of technology in this industry, that it was a big matching game, right? That's what it was. It was a big matching game. As we started to get more volume, you couldn't manage this in your head. And so understanding where available loads were, available trucks were, and matching them together. So I understood the nature technology could play, even though I wasn't, I took a couple Pascal courses or something in college. And so I started to try to
literally no one's going to know what that is. I have no idea what that is. No one's going to know what a Pascal
Fortran, right? There's another one, right?
No idea what that is either. I'm a history major. What do I know about anything?
But that's what I started to focus on building technology, and that was really the first forays of technology for American Backhaulers. And we can talk more about that in a little bit if you want.
You were kids. Did you think about what if what we're doing fails, or what if it doesn't work? Were there things you did that didn't work?
Oh yeah. But the beauty of an entrepreneurial business, that is the beauty. You just do stuff. If it works, you do more. If it doesn't, you stop and you do something different.
Did you think about, okay.
First of all, I got to acknowledge that going in, it was a job for me. I was getting paid a lot of money, like $15,000 a year, I think was my first salary at American Backhaulers. And pretty soon, we eventually separated ways from the consulting firm pretty quickly. And I got commission and started to make money, right? I don't remember what our original commission structure, but it was probably a third, because the original financial model that Paul had was a third, right? A third for commission, a third for administrative costs, and a third for profit of the gross margin, right? Of GP. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, and that still holds pretty true until it was determined that what you want to do is not make a third, you want to lose a third, which is the new financial model of brokerage, right? Because it's all about growth. But what were we talking about?
So we were talking about did you, what would it have been? Did you think about failure? Like, you jumped into it, it was a job. So you didn't think about failure then. You didn't care?
So I had no risk, right, initially. And it was moving so fast. I just think we were moving. Paul did the initial investment, but that was a very limited investment from him too, that he had, I think, made trading options. He had made some money trading options, invested that in initial cash flow, right? The barriers to entry for brokerage were tiny. right? Phone and computer, and you didn't even need a computer then. It was a phone. There's no authority. The authority stuff was easy. The surety bond was, next to nothing. So then it's cash flow. It's because that's the other thing I think we really realized. Don't screw your carriers. Pay them immediately, pay them steady, build credit. When that, Ryan, when we started, when I started Optimal Freight and you were on board, I started off paying the carriers in one day. And it wasn't for early pay. And I gradually pushed that down to about 20, right? Gradually, because I needed that credit rating to even be able to get carriers to haul a load for me. So I think we understood really quick, you take care of your carriers in every way, shape, or form, including and now I'm digressing a little, but we were the number 2 or number 3 client for a lot of carriers pretty quickly. If we were the number 1, that was a problem. Right? If a broker is the carrier's number 1 client, and it probably is for a lot now, that was a problem. They wanted to have a business that we were helping fill their lanes, balance their networks, but we could be their number 2, their number 3. They'd get into financial trouble because their customers are paying in 45 days or slow down or whatever. They'd come to us and we'd upfront them the money, right? Because that matters, and that word gets. I don't know if it's still true. I think it is. If you screw over your carriers and you get a reputation, that word certainly got around before. I think it probably still does.
I mean, it absolutely does. For anybody who follows, on social media, any of these carrier groups, I follow them constantly. I'm like a voyeur almost, like looking in on these driver groups and talking about brokers. And certainly like there's a daytime television aspect to it, but it's enjoyable. For me personally, now that I'm not a freight broker, right? And I don't get that anxiety about what it means for the broader industry. Was there anything major that you tried that didn't work out, that you look back on it and you're like, oh man, or at the time you really said, this is going to be the thing, and it wasn't? It sounds like right now your life is all roses. So there's got to be something in there.
Oh, I've got lots of life challenges. But if you're talking about the origins of backhaulers, we had the flexibility to try stuff. And if it didn't work, just do something different. That flexibility creates tremendous opportunity to really try something brilliant, right?
How did you cultivate that across the organization then? As you started to scale, how did you cultivate the opportunities for folks to say, hey, it's cool. I say all the time, I say this all the time. It's okay to do the wrong thing. Just do something. Bias towards action. It's okay. If you know that it's going to be wrong, don't fucking do it. But if you're not sure, try it, see what happens. What's the worst thing that happens? The worst thing that happens, nobody's going to die. You're going to fuck up. Who cares?
Right. And I think that little speech you just gave is a motivational speech that in our industry you give to people a lot. Paul's way of saying that to me, the first few days when I sat there scared to death, because he really didn't tell me anything. It was just, he said, pick up the phone. His comment to me was, pick up the phone. And then what's going to happen? You're not going to die, right? So I think the structure, which, that commission structure of a third to the rep happened a lot until we split that third into carrier and customer. 15 and 10, 12 and 12, 10 and 15. That was the models back then, fairly simplistic, and allow people to build a customer base, then start to pass those customers on when they got too much for support people. And that became the training ground. That happened relatively quickly, pretty naturally, and encouraged people to figure out how to do it and figure out their own ways of managing their teams. So I think we did that as an organization really well and preserved that entrepreneurial spirit. And it's as freight brokerage was as pure a free market industry as you could possibly imagine. You charge what you charge, you pay what you pay, and you make the difference. But I would say on a higher level, particularly when I was starting to design the technology and I was building the processes of American Backhaulers and really starting to organize things, I probably did not cultivate leadership, decision-making, and creativity as much as I should have. I would be in my own head with my own ideas on the larger things too much, and alienated some really smart people as a result. But remember, I had no mentoring for management. I was a 22-year-old kid who suddenly this thing started flying, and it was Paul and I working together, and I had a lot of things to learn from.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it amazing? I mean, it's amazing even when I look back in my career and I think about how much I didn't know when I did certain things. Like, when I started Spartan, how little I knew, and how, like, if I went back and did that business today, it would be a totally different business. I mean, not just because the industry is different, but because of what I know about working with people and what I know about my own strengths and weaknesses. And I think that's it's amazing when we kind of look back at that and say, like, man, how much I didn't know at the time, and how little preparation I had for any of the situations I might find myself in. Right. So I think that's interesting. That's an interesting point.
I mean, as for those who have kids and who are kids who are gotten into high school, what they tell you is, Dad, I just want to make my own mistakes. Right.
Yeah, I guess so. You can't, like, you have to touch the hot stove at some point.
Yeah.
I still find it incredibly frustrating. I mean, in our business today, as a consultant, it's like you go into a business and you're like, don't do that. And then they do it anyway. And you're like, well, I said not to fucking do it. So I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to tell you. I can't imagine what that's like, having children and like not wanting them to die. I guess when I tell my cats not to do things and they still do it, I still get worked up about it.
You're telling your cats not to do things. That raises a bigger question.
No, I do that a ton. But I'm very weird, as you know, and as people who listen to this podcast probably already know. So Paul goes on to do Command. You knew Jeff Silver, who is very famous for founding Coyote, as well as the work at Backhaulers. You knew him before Backhaulers, right? So you met Paul coming into like, you just got connected to him sort of serendipitously. Yep. You knew Jeff, right?
Yeah, Jeff and I were camp counselors together. That's how we really became connected. We went to the same camp. He was a year younger. We were camp counselors together for 13-year-old boys, and we had a riot, then lived together a couple summers in Evanston, and really became best friends. And he was at U of M, a year younger than me, and Backhaulers was great, and I encouraged him to join. And so he came on board a year later. And essentially started like the rest of us, started making cold calls and selling, and became very successful. But when I talk about my not giving, and Jeff was very interested in technology for sure. In fact, I talked to you about that steel load board we made, that rack system, ordered, booked, checked in, picked up, delivered. Well, Jeff built that on an what did he build that on? One of the early, maybe even Popular Science computers, and a Commodore 64. Jeff, if you ever listen to this, correct me. I think he built it in a Commodore 64. He built an X moving across the board from order to book to checked in to picked up, delivered. So, but I really built the initial technologies at American Backhaulers. And to be honest about it, I went to a TBCA conference, which was the old Transportation Brokerage Conference of America. It was before the TIA, and I knew what I wanted the technology to do. I looked around, found somebody who had built a proprietary technology and was now selling it. This software guy had built it for a company in Oregon, and it approximated an idea of what I wanted, and I bought it for him for a flat amount with unlimited modifications and went to town and really designed it. Jeff was focused on moving and slinging freight like everybody else. And I would say I did not, one of my questions was to not realize his interest and his talent and bring him into that process. And I held that more close to the vest sooner. And I think that built some conflict over time. But when I tell that story, Jeff is one of the people that comes to mind of that. But we were super, super close friends. I knew his first wife. I knew his kids, Andrew and Matt, when they were born. Yeah.
When you look back at kind of like the early days of Backhaulers, it sounds like it was a lot of fun. It was just like kind of like almost like, I mean, the way you've kind of described this, right now is, like I kind of almost picture it as like if this was a movie montage, there's this is like, there's like a music and it's like some sort of rock music and everybody's like having fun and like all of a sudden, it shows there's like one desk and then there's 20 desks and then there's 50 desks. Is that kind of, is that true? I mean, like when was maybe the first time you kind of looked your head up and said, we have something here? And maybe when was the first time you looked your head up and said, like, man, this is different than I want it to be, or this is, maybe, like maybe where was that first friction point, if you will?
Yeah. So remember, I'm a 21-year-old kid, and this is my first job, essentially, outside of ESMA Chemicals. And
well, hypothetically, you continued to age, but yeah,
busboying at Cafe Bernard. But I just thought this was how it was. Mm-hmm. And I would say our trajectory at American Backhaulers is not that different from a lot of the brokers who have really grown since, partly because we created the model, but it's a cash cow. It's been a ridiculous business for 40 years, once again, until we turned it into a business that can lose money. That you just add people, you throw incentives, and you help people build teams under them, and they teach the people, and it's a natural model for growth, and you're just always hiring. One of Jeff's early innovations, I think, that was an innovation that I had nothing to do with, was a very organized, structured training program and hiring 30 people at a time, right? Before I left Backhaulers, he had just started taking control of that as his initiative. And that was a brilliant innovation that really started to escalate moving to that. Because the challenge is not growing because you have more business, right? You're a rep and you have a lot of business and you need help. So you hire somebody and they get on, and then they get, right. They call the deliveries, that they do, warm leads by calling the deliveries, and they start to build their own business. And it just leads to this natural growth thing, and everybody's making money. And let's face it, those years at Backhaulers, a lot of people were making a lot of money. And that was true at unless these companies were preventing it by their structure, there was a lot of people who could make a lot of money in this business. And Backhaulers was pretty liberal with the commission structure because there was plenty of money to go around. So I would say the friction started to come from twofold. One, you said, when was the moment you said, wow, we really got something? I just thought this was the way it was. I didn't know this was special.
You didn't know the counterfactual? Yeah.
The other question was, at the exact same time, I was going through an amazing period with Ultimate Frisbee with a team called Windy City, which was in a lot of ways equally amazing. Young kids growing up, wielding a national championship in a sport that was really a pioneering sport, right? And the energy there. So I have these two things going on at the same time. And then 1988, I have my first son. So life was full. The 80s were incredible for me. And that maybe made it taking certain things for granted. I started getting very interested in environmental issues, environmental activism, recycling. Most of my clients were involved in recycling. And I started thinking about doing something in that regard. And there started to be some friction between Paul and I, really around, I hated letting people down. That was my pain point. I hated letting customers down. And so whereas Paul would be like, it didn't work. Let's let this one go. We'll find another one. So Paul's attitude was really, let's keep selling more because some doors are going to close, some doors are going to open. And I just hated letting people down. So I would freak out if we blew a load to a degree that was not appropriate, right? Because I had grown up as a kid and I'm in charge of the business and it's now 50 people. And, and so this philosophy around, it's just growth. Let's just get more customers. If we lose one, we'll get another, versus we have a responsibility to take care of, was a point of friction. And at the end of the day, Paul was probably right. And there came a point at which Paul wanted to put Jeff in charge. I ran the company for the first 10 years. And there's deeper stuff to it, but at the end of the day, I took my ball and I went home and I sold out to Paul after 10 years, which was obviously a major error financially, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot to say that early on when I was developing the technology, I was an employee at first, but within the first 2 years, I bought in to 25% of the business. So I was a part owner, and Paul never let anybody else buy in after that, after I sold back then.
You more or less said, I took some things for granted. Like, what did you mean by that? Like, what would you take for granted, and kind of how has that impacted you going forward in terms of how you think about, how you've thought about the rest of your career after that, which we haven't even gotten to, and is still incredible. Like, there's still great things in there.
Yeah, once again, there was a lot going on in my life. And I just was flying by the seat of my pants, doing what I do, doing my skill set and my talent. And I was blessed to have met Paul, blessed to have found this opportunity, blessed that I was given the freedom to let it go, my creativity go, and it was working, right? Backhaulers, there's no question. Certainly, Backhaulers is not successful if it weren't for Paul. Backhaulers also doesn't get it if it wasn't for me. No question about it. And Jeff, then after I left, took it to another level and took the technology to another level after I left. But so I had a big impact. But that I did not realize how unique of an opportunity that was. So I took that for granted because that was my first job, and I just honestly figured. This is how it is. I'll just do it again with something in the environmental industry.
So that's interesting because I think when I look at my, again, kind of this podcast is selfish, and I mean, certainly hope that it has some impact on other people, but it's a learning journey for me as well. When I look back at my journey, I think similarly. I think I certainly had opportunities with you. I had opportunities after that I didn't understand how unique they really were. But I would say where I sit today, I'm not as far along on my journey as you are, obviously, but as I sit here today, I feel like it was really lucky that I'm lucky actually that I didn't realize how unique they were. And there are certainly financial differences in sort of that for you as like Backhauler specifically as compared to other things, but as compared to my journey. But I actually think that if I had realized how unique some of the opportunities I have had were with you, with Spartan, with Freight AI, with starting, doing my own thing and having it fail, I wouldn't have the breadth of experience. I wouldn't have the breadth of the network that I have. To really feel as fulfilled and happy as I do today in my career and in my journey. It sounds like you feel differently, like you not realizing how unique of a situation that was, had implications. Do you feel that, is that because you feel like you haven't replicated what you guys had at Backhaulers, or is there something else tied up into that?
Yeah, so those are all really good questions and comments, and I think the other side of the coin, there's no way to. I didn't realize it for a few years because I didn't want to, but there was no way to not looking back realize that was a mistake to sell prematurely, right? And Paul did not want me to leave, and told me so. But I'm a restless mind.
Same.
And you are too, Ryan, very much so. And that's why I'm an entrepreneur and I like to start things. My father was an entrepreneur, right? My father was a cantor, which meant he was actually the one in his synagogue that was visiting the sick and going to hospitals and having choirs and doing weddings. And he was always there emotionally for everybody. He was playing the role of a rabbi. He was getting paid next to nothing, and he wasn't in charge. So he went and became a rabbi primarily so he could build his own congregation. And he was an entrepreneur and he did everything. He was a calligrapher and he designed the art and he built the marketing and he helped do the real estate and he did. And so you talked about this before. Some people really know what they want to do. My brother knew he wanted to play music by the age of 10. And that's what he did. And then eventually he dropped out of school. My brother Hillel, he dropped out of school. It's after his freshman year at the University of Iowa to start playing in the bars there. Played in music for the next 10 or 15 years, then went back to school, got his undergraduate degree, got his law degree, and now he's an IP attorney representing musicians, and he's still in the music world. That's his life. For me, and I think for you, life is more of a smorgasbord. So being an entrepreneur allows us to dabble a little bit in everything, but sometimes you need to be disciplined and stay put to reach your the best place. So the next question you asked me, do I feel like I haven't gotten to that level since?
Or is that why?
I would say that Jeff, one of the reasons Coyote was such a success is when Backhaulers first sold to CH, Paul had a exit after that he was planned on, right? And Jeff was not an owner and wanted to be in charge of all the brokerage of CH. And he did not really get that opportunity. Whatever happened there, he didn't really get the opportunity. Look, CH, the technology that Jeff had transitioned my technology to what he built was Express, which I still think may be the best TMS ever built. And those who worked on it probably will agree. And CH is still running on it, right? Whatever it's called is still built on Express. And that's why they bought it. But he wanted to be in charge. He got dissed by it, and he had a chip on his shoulder, and that, no question about it, motivated him. I'm sure hopefully one day you'll have him on this podcast.
I hope so too.
For me, I think absolutely, I did not get the credit that Paul and Jeff got in terms of pioneers, and nor do I probably deserve it because, they did American Backhaulers, they did Command and Coyote. Now Jeff is on to something else. And I will say that it gives me great pleasure to know that I helped get you going and to see how creative and how much of a contributor and how much a part of you are of this industry. Same thing was true for Paul. We now are on the spinoffs of the spinoffs of the spinoffs from American Backhaulers and people's kids, right? And that is a wonderful thing. Whereas you need to protect some proprietary stuff and IP, intellectual property and stuff, and non-competes. We also love to see the spread and the foster and people really being able to flourish and succeed. So I think for a while I struggled with what I lost. And I don't think in terms of the brokerage model that I have had the success of either one of those guys. But I think FreightFriend gives me the opportunity to really deliver my operational understanding and my mantra of how certainly brokerage can create value and how shippers and carriers should work together to the industry. And I see that as ultimately a legacy that I can leave. And I think over time, I've made a fair amount of solid impact on a lot of people.
Yeah, you've definitely made a solid impact on me for sure, as I said on the lead in. And not that I'm just one person and I'm not even really that important, but I think you're right. It's interesting. I had Ted Alling on here of Access America, who sold, famously the Chattanooga, the backhaulers of Chattanooga is kind of the way that I kind of described it. Right. I mean, and the way that I've kind of come to understand the universe of brokerage, broadly, I've said that Chicago's on its third wave of brokerage, right? There was Backhaulers, then all of these spinoffs. Of the spinoffs, Command and Coyote were sort of like the big dogs. And now you have
AFN.
Exactly.
Redwood came out of there, right?
And now you have all of the spinoffs from those shops, right? Like Molo certainly, and Andrew's connection there, but even others. Like, so now you have this third iteration. I mean, I would say even my brokerages were third iteration spinoff or third wave, if you will. Chattanooga's on their second wave. I mean, if you look at Chattanooga, you had Access, they come in, Coyote buys them, you still, Coyote sticks around. But then you have all of these other spinoffs like Steam and others, even if they're not direct descendants, right? But there's this community of brokers where you can't walk outside in Chattanooga without, falling over a broker. So I certainly think that's something to hang the hat on. So you stayed out of brokerage for a while. You stayed out of transportation for a while. You did greener cleaners. You did some environmental stuff. let's talk about maybe getting back into the industry.
Yeah. So
why did you do that? And kind of like how did you think differently maybe about what your journey would be like the second time?
So I built a few businesses. Greener Cleaner was my environmental effort, a tough business. I started a primary care group of physicians that really tried to dabble in managed care in the 90s. Got them going and off the ground. And then the Greener Cleaner was a dry cleaning business that was a pioneered in environmental technology in the US. So that was my environmental bent. We were a public-private partnership with some really smart people, but it's a tough business. So I stuck around trying to make that a success for longer than I probably should have, because I don't really accept failure very well, and made it successful. But it's a modicum of financial success that you're going to get with the dry cleaning business, though there are some people who've made a lot of money, and it's just a tough business for what the workers have to do. It's tough business. So it was an interesting choice. I'm sure Paul and Jeff still laugh about that. But I actually, to be honest with you, it was 2000. It was early 2000s, and my kids were going to college, and I needed to make money again. I had made $500,000 in the mid 80s. So I went back to the industry I knew I could make money at. I was fortunate that one of the key people that I had helped, that I had hired and taught the industry to, and was absolutely a key person in the industry, John Thompson, had started a company called American Transport Group, and he had studied with a partner, Harold Gross. Harold Gross and I went to grade school together. Harold Gross had been outside the industry, had been, I think, in law school. And he actually came in, and I trained him, handed him all my customers when I left, and he was grateful for that. And John Thompson was the head of carrier sales at American Backhaulers, and was as critical to backhauler success as any one of us. Paul, Jeff, me, John Thompson's name should be right up there. Very low-key guy. He doesn't get a lot of press, so he built ATG. I wish him all the best. So they gave me an opportunity to get back in the industry in the early 2000s, and that's how I got back in. And interestingly enough, so this is an interesting story. I came in. I was 40, right? I was 40.
What year were you born?
And
what year was this?
This was.
Why
are
you looking at me, man? I don't know. You should know how old you are.
And everybody else is in their 20s, right? And sure. I'm on the floor hustling freight, and I'm they gave me the flexibility to do any side I wanted. And so the first thing I did is I booked a carrier on a load, right? It had been a little while, and that driver drove off the side of a mountain and died. That was the first load I booked getting back in the industry. I think I told you that story before. So
what do you think? That's interesting. So, this is another way. I didn't plan this when I wanted to have you on, and there's like parallels I'm drawing today that I've never sort of drawn before in our relationship. When I joined Echo, I was 25 or 26. Came out of law school, failed path to Echo. I'm on the floor with a bunch of 22-year-olds, 21-year-olds, 23-year-old kids who are, they're not that much younger than me, but still, like, I was like, a trained monkey could do most of this work, right? Like, and that's where my interest in technology started. I mean, I remember when I first started at Echo, Brad Keywell or whatever the other guy's name was,
Eric Lefkowski
came in. Yeah, it was Brad or Eric. One of them comes into the training room, is like, we're built on technology. And I'm like, you are? Because there's 30 people in this room with me who are just don't know anything. And all you're trying to figure out is how to get them to make more phone calls. And there's 700 kids out there, and all they're doing is making phone calls. It's like, how is this a technology play? And then anyway, so I get on the floor, and I had that, I felt so defeated because I was only 26 again, because I'm 26, and like all of these kids, are just here. I could have done this 4 years ago. I don't have to be smart. All I have to know how to do is pick up the phone and dial it. And that in and of itself, that motivation is important and valuable or whatever. You're 40, you're hustling freight on the floor. I don't know, did that feel any different, or was that you feeling like maybe I'm just getting my feet wet again, or how, I don't know, how did especially after Backhaulers, Robinson, you're probably, you're thinking, man, I really missed out on the boat there, whatever. I mean, how did that feel?
It was very challenging, and it's why it didn't last that long. And I would think Harold is justifiably not too happy with me because I didn't stay long, and he gave me a chance. But I am definitely an entrepreneur, and part of what allows you to be able to do things that you may not want to do is having the vision to where it's going to get you. And at that organization, I really didn't see the path to me being able to be creative. They had already had an IT guy building their tech. They had that under control. There really wasn't, other than hustling freight, I didn't see the path to being able to be an entrepreneur and creative. And although the other businesses that I had built may not have been great moneymakers, pioneering an environmental technology on the dry cleaning industry in 1995, we were known around the country, and we did some pretty cool stuff. We were handed a technology, and we realized after they trained us that they didn't know what the hell they were doing, and there was no technology. So we had to figure it out. And that's what I like to do, is I like to start from zero and figure things out. And you need to at least have the vision to where you're going to go. So my recommendation to entrepreneurs, a mistake that I made with Jeff, is make sure all your employees feel empowered, and try to identify their skill set. You as a manager have an obligation to help that person figure out what they're good at and like to do, and position them to find that and succeed. And if you don't, they're going to go somewhere else. If all they care about is sales and making money, you're probably not going to hold on to them, because they're going to get one good client, and then somebody's going to pay them $250,000 and hire them away, and that's too bad for them. But I think that was really hard when I was 40, for sure. There was a couple of other issues. And so I'm a startup guy. I like to build from the ground up. I like the creative aspect of it.
So how did you end? So ATG, did something happen between there and Echo, or how did you get to Echo?
Let's say essentially, in the middle there, I went to business school, right? When I first left Backhaulers, I went to business school, got my MBA at U of C. But pretty soon thereafter, I ended up at Echo in 2007, and I was hired by Eric and Brad. Echo at that point was an LTL company primarily. They were doing some managed truckload freight for a few truckload clients, a few clients that they started out as LTL, but really had no idea how to do truckload brokerage. They had made a couple of efforts and never really succeeded. So I was hired to build the truckload side, and there was two challenges there. One is I'd never really worked for anybody. So there was a big learning curve there. I sort of did at ATG for a little bit, but ran into a little bit of a wall there. And I had never gotten the skill set of coming up, because I was in charge by the age of 23, and then was an entrepreneur after that. And the second challenge was there was some weird cultural stuff in the leadership. Orazio Buzzo was president. I reported to him. Great guy, very talented manager. But getting the ability and the opportunity to do what I was brought to do took a while. And trying to introduce truckload sales to people that are used to selling LTL, there just wasn't, they didn't get, it took so long to introduce to them the fact that it's not zip rate, that it just doesn't work the same. And that quoting a rate doesn't give you guaranteed capacity, because there's not a bunch of local drivers there to pick it up. It's a different model, and to the process of building relationships and building a whole carrier team. So it took me a while just to earn the right to do what they brought me to do, which was incredibly frustrating. But once they gave me a chance, I designed the whole truckload technology. I made them pull the whole accounting department out. I brought in a person who had come out of another brokerage to woman to lead the accounting department. And she knew how to do it. And we just pulled it completely out. so that we could pay the people on time. They weren't paying anybody on time. It was death from the get-go on the truckload side. And redesigned the technology, made the split model, and pulled a whole truckload side, took the whole sales side apart and built the whole truckload side. And you know that what that was like. And interesting enough, Groupon, probably when you were there, Groupon started on the truckload side of backhaulers when they first started.
Right? Yeah, I remember the kids wearing like fucking pajamas to work every day. And I'm like, who the fuck are these people? You know, and they had those like balls that they would sit on or whatever, those yoga balls. I'm like, why are these people here? Especially because at the time, I think we had to go like business casual, you know. As I've heard you talk about your journey before there, that sounds like the kind of thing you might have given up on and tried something else. What made you stick this one out?
At Echo, you're talking about?
Yeah, at Echo, yeah.
I didn't. I left after. Well, interestingly enough, I stuck it out. I probably was ready to leave, and then I finally was given the opportunity to do what I wanted to do, which was full entrepreneurial build.
I thought you were going to say that you met me, but okay, yeah, go with this instead. Go ahead.
I would say, Ryan, that you came in. There was a person on the carrier side that was a really solid early hire, and you were a really solid hire at the customer side, and you were my right-hand man for my customers, right? And your being there allowed me to do what I wanted to do, which was to build a business. So, and hopefully you learned a lot and got the opportunity to flourish, but you started out taking care of customers and everything that involved and quoting. And that allowed me to build a department. And so it was an entrepreneurial opportunity. When that opportunity got closed, I left. When that opportunity was like, somebody came in and they decided it was a little power grab. They brought somebody in who wanted to cut my wings because I was a big ego. And I said, see ya. And I left. And within 6 months, that person was gone too.
There's a lot of people who might look at these different things you've been through and we're, you know, there's still even more to your journey, which we're going to talk about, that has success and failure and that I'm much more familiar with intimately. But, you know, even up to this point, there's people who might look at your journey and say, you know, it's an amalgamation of success and failure. Like they'd look at the backhaulers, they'd look at the end of backhaulers, and they'd say, like, I'm hearing you say, backhaulers was success and it was failure. Like, sure, it didn't end the way that I wanted it to, and I have regrets about that. But there was incredible success in there, and I can't lose sight of that. And, you know, so my first kind of follow question here is, and other things too, like with Echo, right? I mean, Echo's, you know, you've had, there are some really talented people who've come out of Echo. There are some really talented people who are still in Echo that wouldn't be there if they weren't for you. You've built some incredible relationships with folks because of the work at Echo. Somebody like Ben Shukart, who I think the world of at Schneider, who I know you're close with as well. Like there are people, you know, people might look at that, and if they reflect on their own journey, say, well, that's failure. And people struggle with that, right? They struggle with when there's success and there's failure, they fixate on one over the other, right? And one of my hypotheses that I'm exploring with this podcast is it's not all success and it's not all failure. It's always a blend. How do you kind of keep sight on or how have you thought about that, the success and the failure living in a duality and on a spectrum and not being binary? How do you live with, like, you don't look at backhaulers and go, it was a failure because of the way it ended. You look at backhaulers and say, yeah, there was failure in there, and I'm not happy with how it ended, but it was still successful in these ways.
Yeah, so there's no question that I beat myself up for a while in the 90s thinking about the failure once I realized that I made a mistake. But now I don't feel that way at all. And I think as you get older, you start to, if you can stay healthy when you get older, it's pretty great because you have so much experience and you're smart, and you're understanding and you're mature. And I would say for me to describe what you just described is it's the journey. The journey is beautiful. The journey of life, success, failure, meeting people, it's all connected. And it's all about growth. And, you know, I'm going to be 60 this year. And totally looking forward to what's next.
So when you
totally looking
regretted
forward
it,
to what I'm building with FreightFriend. So all of those things, and you know it, Ryan, yourself, that each one of those things that you did, you wouldn't be who you were if each one of those things weren't part of them. You wouldn't have the
Totally.
knowledge that you do, and you wouldn't then be able to reflect on what you would do differently. I don't think I am as much of a student as I would like to be. So my learning curve is a little slower than some people, but I think, and I still fly by the seat of my pants more, as everybody, my dev team will tell you. But everybody gets to know the business really well because nobody's pigeonholed, because I like to teach as part of it. But the journey is the beauty, and keeping a positive attitude and being a good person, and loving and caring for other people, even if your temperament and your anxiety may contribute stuff, as long as you really mean well and you really care, people know that. And you got to be a good person to those around you, and know that it's not a zero-sum game. Everybody doesn't win and lose all the time.
but did you only learn, like when you were in the 90s and you had those regrets, the only way that you got through them by getting older? Because like that's going to take a long time for most people. Like, or did you? I mean, how have you learned to attack those things with and not have the regrets in the moment? Is it just aging? It's okay if that's the answer, but I'm just curious.
No, I would say get back on the horse, right? It's keep moving forward and get back on the horse. Sometimes that processing, sadness is okay. Get in there and figure out what's up. Don't be fearful of it. Don't live in regret, but sometimes process, right? There's a fine line between regret and learning. And I would say in the 90s, that regret took over.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I learned to process it in the 2000s and move forward. The 80s for me was ridiculous. And life wasn't going to always be like that in so many fronts, right?
Mm-hmm.
The 90s were much more challenging. In 2000s, I started to really be able to utilize what I had learned along the journey and start to figure out next steps and move forward rather than regret and process. So I think try to learn rather than regret and get back on the horse.
But how do you, so like, you've also said this, this is something else that I wrote down. You also said like, oh man, I hate failure. But how do you marry that with like, you hate rejection, you hate failure. Yet you do sales and you're willing to be rejected. You're willing to try stuff and see what works. So like, if you hate failure, how do you deal with the fear that you may fail, but still be willing to get back on the horse and not just shut it down and take your ball and go home?
Well, I never said I hate failure. And if you're an entrepreneur,
you literally said I hate failure.
I said
said exactly that.
I hate failing people.
No, you said I hate failure.
I hate letting people down. There's a big difference. And I hate letting customers down, very much so. Much so that was sometimes prevented growth. And I hate letting investors down. When I take somebody's money, it is one of the reasons that I've sometimes have issues fundraising is because I take that responsibility really seriously. And that faith in me, I hate to let people down. For me, my money and risk, I'm an entrepreneur. That's my comfort zone. That's where I live. So I actually have no fear of personal failure.
Where do you think that came from?
I have fear of letting people down.
Where do you think that came from? Did that come, like, is that something you were born with? Is it innate? Like, is it something that developed in you over time? Is it what is the center of that? Like, how do we bottle that?
I think some people are entrepreneurs and some people are not. People who are really anxious about where the money is going to come from and where their paycheck is going to come from may not be set up to be entrepreneurs. I often go into things with really having no idea how I'm going to turn it into a success, and I have confidence that I'll eventually figure it out. The success may be smaller than I might have originally intended, but I stuck around at the cleaner to get it to a level of a success that I could be proud of. And I sold it. And it's still, every business I ever started, healthcare, cleaning, backhaulers, still exists, and people who work there still work there. 40 years, and every business I started still exists. That's a level of success. So I think entrepreneurialism is something, a level of comfort with risk that's different. So I don't think I have anything, I don't want to use the word better, but I just think that's my comfort zone. My comfort zone is not applying for a job and getting rejected. My comfort zone is starting something from scratch, not worrying about where the money's going to come from and figuring out how I'm going to make it work. And I've got enough skills to be able to do that. And Ryan, I think, you learned some things from me, but some of you and I are similar in a lot of ways. I think that's one of the ways that we're similar. You like the creative process of building something new. This podcast, this, businesses that you've started. And I, while I regretted to see you go at Optimal Freight, and there were reasons that you went, the real reason that you went is you wanted a new challenge. You wanted to be in charge.
Yeah, totally. Yep. And now I want to not be in charge of anything. So, maybe I was, but I had to learn that.
Well, you're in charge of the editing of this podcast, so we'll see.
No, I'm not. I have someone else who edits it. I pay people to do the things that you don't want to do. It's interesting, as the observation of like not, rejecting applying for jobs is not being in your wheelhouse is a good. I mean, up until maybe a year and a half ago, I still had every rejection letter I'd ever gotten from, summer associateships I applied to, from every law firm I had sent my resume or cover letter to, and I kind of carried that with me for a while, and I had to kind of go through this exercise of getting rid of those. And because I had every single one of them, some of them weren't even open. I just knew it was going to be a rejection letter because if they wanted an interview, they would have fucking called me, right? But you're, that's right. I never thought of it that way. So getting into kind of like, so you start Optimal. We've spent a lot of time together, but like, I want to kind of talk about the rest of your journey too, still a little bit. You start Optimal. I mean, the first day you're skiing in Aspen. So I'm sure the first day was really great because like I had to sit on the floor.
I always forget about that.
I don't, because I had to show up at 7 a.m. because you told me the furniture would be there.
Furniture deliveries, right.
Right at 7 a.m. They don't show up till like 3 o'clock.
I don't think I was skiing at Aspen though, because
you absolutely were.
I only went there one time and I didn't actually like that mountain. But
I remember you telling me that you were in Aspen skiing.
Maybe.
And that I needed to, anyway, because you weren't going to get to take a vacation for a while is what you said. So anyway, you were right about. So, so we start Optimal, and I remember, it was those early days were really, were interesting. I mean, they certainly were different than the way you had described Backhaulers. Obviously, I mean, our success wasn't as sort of like explosive or revelatory, but tell me a little bit about what the journey was from Optimal. I mean, you had a successful exit there too. Why don't you spend a little bit of time talking about that, and then a little bit of a time about, maybe what got you into FreightFriend. It's something you'd been working on for a while, but maybe kind of marry those two together to kind of draw this into a close.
Yeah. So, Optimal was the natural place for me to go after I'd worked for somebody. I licensed Optimal before I took the job at Echo.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the idea for FreightFriend before I took the job at Echo. And in fact, started the idea for it and even building it before I took the job at Echo. And I was looking for a name for this company, and I thought of My Freight. So I go on to whatever, GoDaddy or whatever it was, and I look up My Freight. And it's owned by some company called Echo Global Logistics with Doug Wagner's name there. He was the CEO. And I was like, who is in Chicago brokerage that I don't know? Who are these guys? So I picked up the phone and I called Doug. And we had coffee together. and they ended up hiring me. I had already leased a space for Optimal Freight on Ravenswood, down the block from where we started, from Joe Hayes, the landlord then. And Joe let me, I had to get out of that lease. Joe let me out. And I went to work for somebody for 3 years, which was for me really hard. I learned a lot about, working in a larger corporate environment and a lot of other things. And I introduced a lot of other people to the Truckload 101, right? Of course, you came there, which was a great introduction, had the wonderful opportunity to work with Ben Schukart, who really came for a very short time to Echo and made a big impact on Echo, on me. And I think I made an equally big impact on him. And is still a friend, one of my best friends, brilliant guy. But so when I left, so really FreightFriend, this idea, which started from, my kids getting on MySpace, I think the idea of having this friendship-based marketplace came out of that. And that really that was a great way for people to collaborate. I always thought about technology in terms of how it impacted people operationally. That's where my approach to technology always was. So I really put that on hold when I went to work for Echo, and put Optimal Freight on hold when I went to work to Echo. So it was easy that right when I left there, I just dove into both of those things.
Right.
FreightFriend was a marketplace only. When Optimal Freight started, I had a brokerage. I knew that when Backhaulers sold to CH, the TMS technology expertise was out of the bag, and that was disseminated around the industry. So I thought I could find a TMS off the shelf. What it didn't have is the full CRM functionality and the matching functionality to do it the right way that I had built originally. So I ended up choosing MercuryGate and helped them improve their brokerage side. And then I enhanced FreightFriend to be not just a marketplace, but also a full CRM, because I needed that for Optimal Freight. And that. That's how you got very familiar with FreightFriend initially, and did it as a side project. But Schneider ran their entire carrier sales team on FreightFriend for 4 years, and a number of other really large clients in an old legacy .NET platform. But it was a side job for me while I was running Optimal Freight. I had originally partnered with MercuryGate to be part of their suite, thinking they would sell it. Monica and I became very dear friends, and then we chose to go our separate ways. It didn't work out the way I wanted it. Maybe I wasn't willing to give up control at the end of the day, and I took it back. And then when I sold Optimal Freight to TFI in the end of 2018, middle of 2018, I went full time into FreightFriend, found a development team to rebuild it from the ground up. And really, for me, this has been a riot, because not only do I have the creative process of building a business, but I'm learning I've never built a technology business before, right? I've built operational brokerages and technology for them, but this is building a technology business and SaaS model and customer success and carrier success, and managing really having control of managing a dev team and product involved in that. And so I'm having a wonderful time. Its success will be determined on my ability to bring in talent and give them the space to really flourish. But we're blessed to have a phenomenal dev team, and I think our technology blows everybody else's away. There's a lot of people, everybody else who's trying to do any procurement related stuff away. And Ryan, you've talked about it, that a TMS can't do everything well, and that the TMS of the future,
it can't do even everything adequately.
Right. And
let alone well.
So, Ryan, you can share your feelings about it but I wholeheartedly agree that TMS should be about execution and should play well with others to connect to the latest, greatest for pricing, for procurement, for compliance, for back office. And FreightFriend's focused on the procurement space, built on the concept of build relationships with people. Those relationships need to matter, and drive freight and utilize technology to make that relationship as efficient as possible.
It kind of sounds to me like, and I love that you have fun with FreightFriend, and that I'm a big fan of it. I always have been, and I love what you've built to this point. And here's my last question for you before we wrap up. You've said some of your businesses haven't been as successful as you wanted them to be, or the exit, or they haven't gotten as big. has how do you think about that in the spectrum of success and failure? Like, is that like, it seems like you look more at the successes.
I think I've become more accepting of who I am. Maybe that's a cop out, though. I'm a startup guy. That's my comfort zone. I like zero.
Mm-hmm.
And my ability to really ramp will be dependent even now. I mean, let's talk about Costa, right?
Mm-hmm.
Charlie Safro connected me with Costa when she had just started CS recruiting. And I think she'd probably say that was one of the best people placements she ever did. And I did not give Costa the place to become the space to become what he could have become. And I, you maybe as well, Jeff, there's a lot of history of that. So if I'm, I'm old, but I'm not old enough that I still don't have to learn new tricks. And that new trick for me will be finding talent, attracting them because of my reputation, my intelligence, my creativity. I can talk a good game, but then giving them the space to take it and run with it. And I think FreightFriend is positioned to do it.
I'll tie this back into the Bulls really quickly. I just finished watching Last Dance, as I mentioned earlier, or I didn't mention this to you earlier. I just finished watching The Last Dance. And one of the things they said about Jordan in there was, and I didn't grow up in Chicago, so like I wasn't a big Jordan guy. I'm not a big, Bulls fan, but they said about Jordan, like he lived in the moment sort of better than anybody else, right? And he wasn't worried about kind of what happened before. He kind of has this, and I've had this or I've tried to learn this philosophy, and I've said out loud before. It's like it's not about the last one; it's about the next one. I remember one time you and I got into it a little bit at Optimal, where you were saying, like, we had some problem with a shipment, and you're like, Ryan, you don't seem to care, and I'm like, no, I care, but like I'm focused on, I'm not going to beat my chest and cry over it. Like I'm focused on what do I do about it. It's not about the last one; it's about the next one. I'll figure out what happened. I'll deal with that later once the problem is solved. But like crying over spilt milk doesn't do anything. But it sounds to me like. And it sounds to me, honestly, like in this whole journey, like your philosophy on it today, and maybe it wasn't your philosophy always, is just keep going. Like the real failure almost is giving up. Like if you just keep going, something will happen. And I think it's not success. Success isn't everything, and like failure isn't losing everything. Right? Like, and success isn't necessarily gaining everything. If you try something and it fails, it doesn't mean you go to zero, you're bankrupt, you're homeless, you're begging for money on the side of the street for most folks. Like, it means that you can go, it just means you have to keep trying. And if you quit, that's when you're fucked. Is that a fair way to kind of summarize how you think about it today?
Well, I would change that.
Okay.
I think, once again, it's the journey. That success and failure have become much less important. That I'm comfortable in my legacy, even if I do nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
I'm comfortable financially to some degree. And my kids are amazing, right? Somehow, with the way my journey went, I have 2 boys and a stepdaughter who are 3 amazing individuals, and I learn from them every day. My son, my oldest son in business, I turn to him for learning every day on SaaS technology, and he's building a tech startup himself called Early Bird, which is in the fintech space, which is providing financial literacy to newborns and to young people through a gifting program. So I think the journey, it's not about, I'm much less focused on success or failure. I'm focused on enjoying the ride. And then the secondly is switch regret to reflection so that you can learn. And so that the ride is a progression and you are growing. And so that's different Yeah, I think that how you described it.
Okay, that's fair. Thanks for sharing the time. This was an enjoyable. I think this was great. Thank you for sharing the time. Again, thanks for everything you've done for me in my career and before doing this podcast. Tell people where they can learn more about FreightFriend or about you.
Yeah, FreightFriend.com. Please go look. And Noam at FreightFriend.com. I've always liked to use my first name as my email address. Please reach out and would love to talk. Ryan, thank you so much for bringing me on this podcast. It's really been great. You're awesome at leading these kind of things and at everything that you do. And thank you for everything you've done with me, because I know it wasn't always easy. So all the steps along my journey that you were a part of were really meaningful to me.
It was rarely easy, and also I appreciate you. I appreciate you saying I'm great at everything I do. I can say for certain I am not, but I'm trying shit to see what happens.
Yeah,
I'm good at a lot of things that people see, but I'm really terrible at everything that nobody sees. Anyway, thanks a ton, Noam. I really appreciate it. And for everybody listening, thanks for being a part of me. Don't forget to subscribe. And until next time, thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Inside the Founders Studio. A couple quick things before you go. We're proudly hosted on the Logistics of Logistics Network. To hear more content from the industry's top leaders in supply chain and logistics, check out thelogisticsoflogistics.com. And until next time, onward and upward.